the stretchy spine that I'm talking about is based on the ribbon spine setup, but instead of using a piece of geometry and joints and hair follicles, I've simplified it to make my own sort of easier version of it. So of course first you need to create your joints for the spine. So just quickly I'm going to create 4 or 5 joints, essentially equally spaced. I'm going to select all my joints and I'm going to increase their radius so that they're all the same. And this is just so that it makes it a little easier to see them in the video when you're working. You can also use this to help you when it comes to selecting joints. You change their sizes so that if you do have overlapping chains or something like that, it makes it a lot easier to make selections. So now we have 5 joints, and we want to actually name all of our joints as well. So I'm going to select each joint, and right up top in Maya you have this little pull down where you get an option of selecting by name, renaming, so on. I'm going to choose rename, and so I've selected all 5 joints. It only shows the last one selected, but what I can do is I can quickly come in and I can just name these, let's say SP for spine and JNT for joint, and press enter, and what it'll do is it'll name them sequentially starting with the first one. It'll basically call the first one spine joint, but the next one will be spine joint 1. Now this will only work if each joint is selected and they're not parented together, because if they're in hierarchy then it won't necessarily recognize the other names that already exist, and mine won't automatically number them. Okay, so now we have the first joint. So what we want to do first is we want to set it up so that each one of these joints, like my stretchy FK structure, have a 0 position. However, with this structure, instead of doing a lot of instead of combining the control curves that we're going to have, we're going to actually assign control curves to each joint. So I could have just set up one joint with this and then duplicated it and then done all the naming, but I just wanted to show you this way because it's a little clearer. So I'm going to create a NURBS curve to start, and just drop that right here. And I'll create locators, even though you won't really need them. I'm going to create locators just to make it a little easier to see the influence of things as we move forward. And we can use them as aim targets as well. Okay, so we've got our control curve. I'm going to just rename it right away, and we'll call this one control. I'll call it 1 for now. And we'll call this one aim 1. Okay, and so this is going to be the first position. It's going to be right here at the base. Okay, and so let me color code these just to make them a little easier to see. So I'm going to throw them on a layer, and I'm going to assign that layer, let's say, color yellow, just to make these a little easier to spot. And I'll take the locators and I'll drop those in a separate layer, just in case we don't want to hide those. And I'll make that layer, let's say, I don't know, green. Okay. So now we can see our locator easily, and then we've got our joints. Right. And just for argument's sake, I'll throw those in a layer too. And we'll make those this bright blue color, and I'll actually name the layers. So I'm going to say joints, and we'll call this one aims. Now remember, when you're building any rig or any model, that you want to name everything that you create, just to make it a little easier for you and anyone else that needs to go in later, maybe make changes, fix things, or even just select specific parts and hide them. Okay, so now we have our individual joints, we have the one control here, so I'm going to take my aim I'm going to parent that to the joint later, but right now I'm going to take my curve and my locator, I'm going to duplicate them, Control D on the keyboard, or Command D. If you're on a Mac, it works, both work, Control and Command D. And then I'm going to snap these up so they line up with the next one, and then I'm going to do a duplicate special, and it automatically moves and aligns them the same distance. Since the joints are equally spaced, it'll move them equally the same distance. And I'm going to take all my locators. And by the way, duplicate special on the keyboard is Shift D. So I'm selecting all of my locators. I'm going to come over to the channels box on the right, and I'm going to resize all of my locators just so they're a little less obtrusive. This way I can sort of separate things out a little more visually. Okay, and so I'm doing it in the shape so that if I decide to freeze any transformations on the locators, the scale should be maintained, because when you freeze transformations, it actually doesn't touch the shape history. Select each curve. I'm going to create a group around it by pressing Control or Command G on the keyboard, and then I'm going to center pivot. So now we have our group at 0. And if you really wanted to, there are ways to create your joints at 0. But right now we're going to leave them as is in their individual groups. So I'm creating a group around number 2, number 3, centering pivot, selecting curve, creating a group, centering pivot. Each one of these groups I'm going to name. So this group is going to be, let's see, we'll call this one, actually we'll just call this one control group 4. How about that? Control group 04. How about that? Okay. So I'm going to do the same thing with the next one. So I'm selecting the curve, pressing the up arrow to select the group around it. I'm going to put the name in. This is going to be control group 3. One below that is going to be control group 2, obviously. Okay, and our first and our last one don't really require a group, since they're going to be our anchor points. So now I'm going to take each joint and I'm going to parent it to the locators. And that's simple as selecting the joint, selecting the locator, press P on your keyboard, or you can even do it in the outliner by middle mouse clicking the joint and dragging it to the locator. That will also parent it to the corresponding locator. So shift select the joint, shift select the locator, press P. Okay, and then we're going to go in reverse. I'm going to take the locator, shift select the locator, shift select our curve, control, and press P. And do the same thing for each control group. Or actually, control element. Locator, parent it to the control curve. Okay. So now we should have all 5 controls. When we select them, everything should highlight. Okay. And if you look in your outliner, what you should see is your 2 main controls and then 3 control groups. Okay. So now we're going to set up the stretchy part. Right now you have all of your controls in place. And before we start doing the stretchy part, let's take all of the controls and make sure that their translate Y is at 0. And instead of moving them to 0, what we're going to do is we're going to freeze them at 0. So I'm just going to freeze the translates on all of my elements. Okay? So now what we have is we have our zeroed out curves across the board. Okay? So now they're all at their default positions. So now we're going to start setting up the stretchy part. Because essentially these joints are going to be the ones that we're going to that your mesh is going to be bound to, so that when we actually move this control, it'll keep them relatively equally spaced. And as long as you paint your weights well, that should, then your stretch should be pretty clean. So I'm going to select my control curve. We'll start from the bottom. Usually what I want to do is we want to take this control in the middle, and we want it to pay attention to the distance between this control and this control element. But we don't want to constrain the control curve itself directly, so we're going to actually do the group that's around it. So I'm going to select Control 1, just select Control 3, and then I'm going to go over to my outliner. And if you're on Windows, you're going to use Control, or if you're on Linux, you're going to use Control, and then select the last control element, or should I say, in this case, the last thing to select is not the control, but the group around the control. And if you're on Mac, you're going to use the Command key and then just left-click on the control group. And so we have the control selected, and then the last thing selected, which is between them, is the control group that you want to respond to the distance between these two. And so what you're going to do is you're going to go up to the animation menus, and you're going to go to constrain, and you're actually going to do a point constraint. Let me just pull the menus down into my capture area. So we're going to do a point constraint, sorry about that. So yeah, so for the point constraint, we just need it at the defaults. Because we don't want to maintain offset, we want to maintain, we could in this case, but it really doesn't matter because they're equally spaced, so it shouldn't move. If your joints weren't equally spaced, then you probably want to do a maintain offset, so you can maintain your specific or predetermined distance. In this case, we want it equally spaced. So I'm going to press apply, and as you can see, it just constrains the translates of the control group. And if you look down to shapes, you'll see that both the control 1 and the control 3 now have influence. So if I actually selected my control 1, you see that everything inside of control group 2 highlights in this magenta color, showing that there's some influence. And as you can see right away, when I pull it, it keeps the equal distance between the other two controls. So we already have a little stretchy right there. And so we're pretty much going to go up the chain, repeating this process. So I'm going to select control number 4, and then control or command select group number 3, and once again apply my point constraint. Now there's no double transformations occurring here because we're not overlapping control. Because we're using control curves to control top level groups. So the control isn't basically causing any issues. Now if you see, if I take control 4 and grab it, everything in between stays aligned and relatively equal in distance. And last but not least, we're going to do control number 3, control number 5, and then we're going to command or shift select control group number 4, and once again apply. Oops, I think I left it a little askew. Something was off. Just by a little. Alright, let's try that again. So 3, 5, and group 4. Something's still off by a little bit, but it's pretty much there. Alright, we'll leave it for now. Okay, so basically what we have here is we have our basic stretchy already set up. So as you can see, it stretches perfectly, and if we actually translate it left or right, everything aims relative to what it's supposed to. I'm actually experiencing some weird lag right now. I'm not really sure what that's from. It could be from the capture itself, which I do think it's from. Because now we need every one of these joints to pay attention to the relative angle going up the chain. So let's say if I pulled this one, I actually want our joint here to aim in that angle. Right now it's just aiming straight up, so that when it comes to deforming a mesh, your mesh would be a little askew. Now we have all of our controls, and everything is point constrained, right? Okay, so now we need to get the joints to aim correctly. So this is actually pretty simple. You're going to select the control, and then you're going to shift select the locator. And basically what you want is you want your locator to aim at the curve. So you're going to go to aim, option box, and then in your aim settings, basically we've got it, the X is currently pointing up the chain, but the orientation of our locator currently, let's say, it looks like it's Y. So we want our control 2 to have that locator aim up on the Y. Pretty simple. So the aim vector should be 1. You can try fooling around with these aim vectors to try and get it to behave correctly. If you don't want to spend the time to do it, you can just tell it to maintain offset to try and just delete the defaults. But if you can get it to do the right thing, what you'll get is on your rotates, it'll just stay at 0 so that nothing flips in an odd way. So now, when I take my control number 2 and I pull it, notice that locator is now aiming towards it. And that's the kind of thing we want to happen with all of our joints. Alright? So let's get all the rest of these set up like that. So, same thing all the way up the chain. We've got our bottom locator aiming. Now we're going to do the same thing with the next. So I'm going to select my control 3, so select locator number 2, and again we're going to do the aim. And so on. All the way up the chain. Now I usually do it one direction. I've actually also had people do it in 2 directions where they have everything in the middle aiming out or everything aiming in. It's pretty much depends on your preferences and generally what you plan on doing with the rig. It's also a good idea to take your end joints and have them sort of aim back in. That just sort of maintain the flow throughout the chain from end to end. So what you can do is pretty much the same thing. Make sure all your things are back, all your controls are back in their default 0 positions. Everything looks good. And then take your control that's just on the inside. Just select your locator and then have it aim. So in this case, you may want to do -1 on one of those vectors so that it doesn't flip. Try and get it to stay at 0 or close to it. Doesn't have to be perfect, but you want to get it as close as possible. So bottom one's already aiming, top one's sort of aiming down. As you can see, when I move it, it's maintaining our angle. Let's see here, everything should be aiming relative to the next joint in the chain. Okay. Yeah, capture's definitely throwing my off. Okay, so basically that's creating the basic stretchy and aim setup. But now we need to set it up so that it can actually be brought in and used with the character rig as basically as a spline. Okay, so you notice it stretches perfectly and everything aims like it needs to. So I'm going to 0. Now what I usually do to make this entire thing mobile and scalable and all that is I will actually just select in the outliner all the controls and the groups together, and I'll create one large group around them, and that'll be sort of our, we'll call it our master group, I guess. Okay, so now this, you got your master group, and so you can actually move it around, you can scale it, you can parent it, do whatever you need to. At least when capture isn't throwing the calculations off. But you can move it around and scale it and do whatever you need to just to put everything in place. Because the group itself, it's containing everything, so everything's scalable. And so if you need to replace part of a limb on a character, let's say the forearm, you want the forearm to be stretchy, you could drop this in, basically parent it to the end of the elbow joint, and then instead of, and you can actually bind to the joints in this structure so that you could actually create like a little stretchy limb there. There are other ways to incorporate this into a full skeletal structure and have your stretchy and have your FK control and IK control. It's really tricky, but it's doable. So just to quickly show the integration of this, I'm going to save it, and then I'll load it in and just show you how to drop it into a character. I'm currently working with Maya 2013 just to get used to some of its quirks and some of its newer tools. And there does seem to be a difficulty transferring models between the versions, especially rigged models. So if you're working in 2012, stick to 2012. If you're using 2013, expect to have some difficulty pulling in models from older versions of Maya. So they're just fine. He's only got about 4 joints, but that's okay. I'm going to slip mine in there anyway. And so I'm just going to reference in the chain I just created. Okay, so now you can see the chain is actually much larger than a character. Ideally, what I do when I'm building out the chain that I know I'm going to use with specific characters, I'll actually build it in the same scene with the character just to make sure everything's the right size. And so I'm going to do a duplicate special. But I want to duplicate it and make sure I get all of the connections as well. I'm going to get a copy of it. I think it's duplicate input graph. If it's not, we'll just do the other one, see what happens. So it duplicates the group, kills the prefix on it from the import, from the reference. And now I can come in here and let's move it over to the side, and we'll just take a quick peek. And it looks like it's working. It's Maya still having trouble updating with the screen capture going on. But it looks like it's fully intact though. All the influence seems to be present. Okay. So remember, the stretchy works best if you're grabbing it from the ends and you're not doing a screen capture at the same time. Okay, so now with this group, I can actually just take it and I can scale it down. Notice how it just realigned appropriately. So I can scale it down to pretty much the scale and size I need it. I can take my reference and get rid of that. So I can go to my reference editor. And I can just remove my reference because I don't need it anymore. Okay. Unfortunately, it took a few of my layers with it. So no big deal. Now let's figure out where we're going to stick it on the spine. Let's move this up here. And I can see I can go a little smaller. So we'll scale it down. Now don't forget, since your curves are essentially nerves curves, you can always go in and resize those, reshape them, and even move them outside of the body if you wish to do so. Okay, so I'll put that in place, and if I like where it is, which I kind of do, then we're almost ready to go. Now what we have to do is we come in of the old spine and integrate the new one. So I'm going to take my clavicle, unparent it from the body, close this window, and bring the attribute editor so you can see what I'm selecting at the time. Okay, and so then we come down to our base of our existing joint chain. You can just delete that. And so now the new base of your spine is going to become that master group. And so you can align the joints wherever you need them to be. You can even scale them a little more if they need them a little bigger or smaller or whatever. And then just parent that group into the root of your skeletal structure. And so now you see the spine highlights when you select the root. And then we can take the clavicle, and you can just parent it directly to your control curve if you want to, at the end of your spine. Because this way, when we actually select a root, everything highlights appropriately, and when you grab the handle for that spine to do a stretch, you actually get the stretch, and it takes the rest of your skeletal structure with it. And so this is a nice way to create a little stretchy spine. Doesn't really have any FK control. It's all going to be translate, and it'll automatically angle your joints and your geometry, and then you go in and just clean it up. So it's a little more stretchy and gooey. Remember, you're not selecting the joints, you're selecting your curves to control it. And as I said before, if you decide that, there we go. So if you decide that your curves aren't necessarily in a good place for you, what you can do is you can select all of your control curves, and then you can take their CVs, and using their CVs, you can actually reposition your controls so that if you do have a mesh, like this one for example, you can put the control curves for your spine outside of the body by dragging them like that, or you can put them outside just by scaling them up, and you can also reshape them. You can scale them up based on their individual components, by the way. This way you can scale all of them at once and still maintain their relative position to the joint that they're controlling. And so you can use your CVs to scale them, resize them, translate them, do whatever. And so you can create a nice, simple control structure this way with full stretchy and full control over the mesh. Just make sure that when you're doing the binding that you select each one of the joints that corresponds. Okay? Now do your binding.